Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this morning's or this afternoon, depending on where you are, a complimentary webinar from Value Selling Associates. My name is Julie Thomas, and I'm going to be your guide through this content today as we talk about how we can increase our persuasive skills by tuning in. Just to let you know, today's session is being recorded. The slides are available for download right here from your GoToWebinar taskbar. But in addition, the recording will be made available shortly following today's webinar on valueselling.com. I will also be answering any questions that come up during the webinar, so please feel free to type them into the Q&A bar, and we will address them either as they come up or at the end of today's session. We're thrilled to have you here. So how do we increase our persuasive skills? Well, let's start with what is persuasion. Persuasion is the ability to change or shape someone's opinion or belief. And the interesting thing about persuasion is in order to change or shape something, we first need to know where we are or where the other person or group of people that we are trying to persuade or trying to change, where their current opinion or belief system is. So today's webinar is really about understanding that current state by fully tuning into the individual or group of individuals that you're working with, whether you're trying to change or shape the belief of a colleague or a client or prospect. Persuasion is our ability to do that, and part of that ability starts with our ability to listen, understand, and empathize with the current state. So that's really the focus of today. How can we move somebody if we don't know where they are? I think it's very difficult. So we're going to focus on the number one or the first most important element of persuasion, which is understanding the current state of our prospect or our customer. Before we get into this, we will be live tweeting during today's webinar, and I invite you to join the conversation on Twitter with questions, comments on today's content. If you are able to do that from your mobile device or desktop, please join the conversation with the following hashtags, either hashtag value selling or hashtag VSA webinar. If you haven't already, please find our company page on both LinkedIn or Facebook and follow us for additional and unique content and conversations about topics that are important to sales representatives and sales leaders today. So let's get into it. Let's understand what is the issue with listening. First of all, one of the biggest challenges in listening is that many of us, and especially in the sales profession where communication is the fundamental skill set that we have as sales representatives and sales leaders, is we aren't listening to fully understand. More often than not, we're listening for the opportunity to reply. I often tell the story of many sales reps that I've worked with don't have the two modes of communication of speaking and listening. They have the mode of communication of speaking and waiting to speak. And they're just sitting there almost jumping up and down in their minds, waiting for the prospect or the client to take a breath so they can jump in and tell them something that they think is really important or relevant to the conversation. The challenge with that is we often miss the deep understanding of what is really going on because we're just waiting to speak. We're just waiting to reply. We are just waiting to respond or maybe even react to the comments that we have. And that clouds our ability to really take in the information, the messaging, the intent of the message that's being delivered to us, and fully understand that. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you are some techniques and some ideas on how you can better focus, better listen for the intent of better understanding where they are so that you can better understand where you need to go in your persuasion, education, and the journey of communication that you have. So let's talk about what we're going to learn today, specifically, the objectives that we've laid out for today. First of all, I'm going to address right off the bat the myth of multitasking. We're going to address it head on. In today's multi-channel, multi-communication world, the challenge and the allure of multitasking is huge. Even sitting here on my at my desk this morning as I'm speaking with you, I have two monitors going on. My cell phone is muted, but it's there and it's going to ding at some point. And the allure of trying to see all of those different things going on is real, and there's a fallacy that also accompanies multitasking. We're going to also define what is real listening. What does it look like? Listening and hearing are two different things. Hearing is the physical act. Can your brain actually take in sounds and make sense of them? Hearing is the physical act of what we hear. Listening is a skill set, and it's very different. We all probably can talk about people in our lives that absolutely hear what we say but don't listen to it. Sometimes we may feel like we are the teacher in the background of the Charlie Brown movie with a want, want, want. They're hearing us, but they're not understanding or even listening to what we have. So we're going to define what is listening and what is the skill set that we need to actually develop, because skills don't happen by accident. They do require practice. They do require fine-tuning, and they do require discipline when executing them. And then we're going to talk about what is active listening. How do we do it? How do we demonstrate that we're doing it, as well as why it's important? We're also going to look at what are some of the barriers. What gets in the way of active listening? And in today's world, there are so many different barriers to listening, and we need to understand those in order to minimize those or be prepared to mitigate those barriers. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how, when we actively listen, that will improve our success in sales and persuasion, because persuasion is a part of sales. Convincing and potentially changing someone's opinion or belief in order for them to make a decision to move forward with you, your company, your product, or your service often requires persuasion. Persuasion may be education. Persuasion may be contextual positioning. Persuasion may be storytelling, but it's understanding that active listening and persuasion go hand in hand, because what might persuade one individual will be very different from another. So, why listen? At the end of the day, I don't think any of us will say, hey, listening's not important. I don't need to know what you think. Of course we need to listen. Of course we need to understand. The old saying of we have two ears in one mouth and we should be using those in direct proportion to each other is absolutely relevant today. But here are some things that we definitely know are true in terms of our ability to develop deeper and credible relationships in business. People tend to like people that are interested in them. If you think of the people that are in your life today, whether it's business, maybe it's your manager, maybe it's a colleague, maybe it's a client or a prospect, those that are interested in us become interesting to us. And that is part of developing an important business relationship. The other thing that I think is absolutely true, and a good friend of mine, Sandra, talks about this all the time, people don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. People don't care how good our product is until they know that we understand their situation. People don't care how excellent our services are until they know that we understand their needs, both at the personal and professional level. And so if we want people to know how much we care, we need to listen to them. We need to demonstrate that we absolutely understand them, we understand their situation, we understand them as individuals, and that is all a part of our ability to actively listen. So let's think about, what does this mean in terms of business? Well, there's lots of reasons that we listen, right? Lots of different reasons that we listen. One of them is, as I just mentioned, to develop the relationship. Another one is to get information and discovery. I have never seen a sales process defined from any of my clients in any industry where at some point discovery, or something that is the same concept of discovery, isn't articulated. In other words, we need to question and understand the client's perspective. Discovery is critical, both on their situation. What are the issues and problems? How does the organization lay out? We need to understand that. We need to understand that, and we need to listen to all of those details. Collaboration. Collaborative problem solving in today's selling world is at the top of most of our clients' agendas. Almost every client that I work with today understands what they need and what they need to change. And many of them have that context of what that solution is, that has elements of what I can contribute and elements of what is unique to them. And together, when we collaborate to create a robust solution, that is a better solution than if it's just my solution. So collaboration in today's selling world, I believe, is one of the number one skills that sales reps need to master. And in order to collaborate, you need to understand that current state. Lastly, if we're not listening when we come to negotiate, whether it's negotiating access to another executive, negotiating for more time, or negotiating for an actual purchase decision, we will be at a severe disadvantage, because successful negotiation absolutely is dependent on the amount of information that we have about the prospect and their needs and the why behind their asks. So lots of different reasons to listen. I'm not sure that that's new to us, but it is important throughout the sales cycle and at every juncture of communication that we have. So let's dive into this whole fallacy of multitasking that I talked about. A recent study that I found says that by this gentleman, Jonathan Spira, estimated that the cost of interruptions to the American economy is $650 billion, not a typo, that is billion with a B, that is lost by employees multitasking and being interrupted continuously throughout their day and the tasks they're doing. That's huge. $650 billion. Huge if his assumption is right. Even if he's 50% off the mark and it's $350 billion, it's huge. It's ridiculous. So what does that mean? Well, psychology today also challenged multitasking and the fact that many people think that they can multitask. And here is what the research that they found showed. There is a 40% loss in overall productivity when individuals are switching between tasks. And the reason for that is when you're switching between tasks, the brain actually needs time to refocus and redirect. So whatever that time is for your individual brain, maybe it's a minute as you go back to the piece of paper that you're working on, or the screen or the presentation that you're building. It takes a while and some time for you to kind of put what just interrupted you out of your mind and refocus on the task at hand. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is they found that multitaskers tend to have a 50% increase in errors as well as the overall time to finish a project. I have been known to be a procrastinator in certain situations, and it's always interesting to me when I look at a project and I say, oh my gosh, that's going to take so much time and so much time. So I manufacture the reasons to put it off in my mind to justify why I'm not tackling it. And then 90% of the time when I then do dive into it and I just focus and block out the time on my calendar and do it, it takes a fraction of the time that I actually expected it to take. So when we actually focus, we will save time, and we're likely to not have as many errors in that work. Interesting in this Psychology Today study, 92% of people admit to it. They admit to multitasking during a meeting, whether it's a virtual meeting or a face-to-face meeting. And we've seen it everywhere. How often are we in a meeting where people have their phones out, or people are potentially jotting down notes on a project that's unrelated to the topic here? It's very prevalent. I think it likely happens more in internal meetings than on sales calls, but for sales professionals that are inside and on the phone with people, there can be the allure to look at email or be distracted by other things going on. And on average, the data shows that most people are checking their phone 150 times a day. You do the math for yourself. We're checking our phone almost all the time, which means that is going on at likely when we should be listening to the conversation or the communication or the message at hand. So there is a Zen proverb, and I like to think about this one: walking, walk; when eating, eat. In other words, we need to create the discipline to really focus on listening. If we multitask when we're listening, there's no way for our brains to manage two cerebral things at the same time. You can listen and load the dishwasher at the same time, but you likely can't listen and read at the same time. So if it's an email or it's a text or it's something else, you can't do two higher level thinking processes simultaneously. Our brains just don't work that way. So create the focus in ourselves. So let's also think about what is the challenge with listening. And this is really important when we think of so much of our communication today is virtual. It's email, it's text, it's short bursts of information. It is the luxury even for field representatives to have face-to-face meetings is just that. It is a luxury. Most of our communication today is virtual. Buyers typically only will tolerate meetings when there's a unique and specific need for that face-to-face communication. So what does that do for us? Well, research also told us that over time, only 8% of the message that we ever hear is the actual word spoken. The nonverbal cues, whether it's speed, tone, volume, or body language, override that written communication. When I talk with somebody in my office and I ask how their day is going and they exasperatedly pound on the desk and say, everything's fine, in kind of a loud, aggravated tone of voice, I don't believe the words. I believe the tone and the volume and the actions around the words. And that's true of us in business as well. And when we are dealing with the unspoken word or virtual communication, we have to work even harder to pick up on those nonverbal cues, which in virtual communication, when we're listening, tend to come in the form of speed, tone, and volume. Volume meaning if I'm screaming at you, that's going to give me some clues as to what that underlining message is. The other thing is really important is most people only remember about 25, on the high end, 50% of what is told to them. So that means that we are likely missing 50% of the message. It also means, if we could do in a future webinar, that 50% of what we're telling our prospects is also lost. So how do we mitigate that when we're communicating out? But more importantly, how do we understand that we're likely not capturing everything? We're likely not remembering everything, and that puts us at risk. So from a sales perspective, what are we doing about that? Well, I think most of us are taking notes. We're trying to jot down those key salient points so that we can fill in the blanks and confirm, etc. So the skill associated with active listening, remember, hearing is our ability, the actual physical ability to hear. We have two ears. Sounds come into those ears. They're translated in the brain through all kinds of, biology to messages that we understand. But there's a couple of things that are the skills that we need to develop. Number one, as silly as it sounds, we need to pay attention. We need to tune out what's going on around us and really hone in on what is being said to us. And when I say communicate with the whole self, what I mean by that is we need to really focus on all of the messages that we're receiving. If only 8% is the word, we need to focus on that. If we can do a video call versus just a phone call, that allows us to at least make that eye contact and see some things. It also, in video calls, will dissuade you from multitasking because, again, if I'm talking to you and all of a sudden you're doing something else, it's rude. The other thing that we need to think about as listening is deferring judgment. How often do we jump to conclusions or make inferences or judgments based on what we hear? And when we do that, we prejudice our ability to really understand and listen because, again, our mind is off thinking about what we're thinking about and not thinking about what is important to the prospect or the client. Another thing that I often think is a skill that we need to learn is to allow the message to be completely delivered. That's a very kind way of saying, please don't interrupt the speaker. And sometimes that's hard. But one of the skills that I try to deploy when I'm practicing this is kind of a 2-second rule. Allow yourself to take a breath or allow a 2-second beat to take place to ensure that that other individual that you're communicating with is really done with the message. And focus on that. That is a skill that has to be learned. And allowing us to completely listen. You cannot listen if you are talking. It doesn't work. Just doesn't work. And then respond appropriately. One of the ways that you respond appropriately when listening is by reflecting on that. And we'll talk about one of those techniques in a few minutes. At Value Selling, we call reflective listening being demonstrated as your ability to ask confirming questions, really replaying what you hear and making sure that you got it right. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to open up a poll here real quick. And I'm going to ask you to kind of look at this poll and make a decision. What do you think is the biggest barrier that you observe to communicating effectively? Is it, to listening, which is part of communication, obviously. Is it our own internal bias or paradigm, or do we get in our own way? Is it language barriers? Some of us, there are real language barriers, whether it's dialect or accent, it makes it hard, etc. But what do you find as the hardest or the largest barrier that you have here? And I'm going to give you another couple of seconds. Interesting results. Let me close this out here, and I'm going to share the results with you. So look at this. 21% think that one of the barriers is bias. The good news about if it's bias, that's an internal, controllable issue that we can address. 10% of us say it's language. That's something, again, that we can overcome with effort, etc. Technology. Be interesting to see in the question how you see technology as becoming a barrier to listening. I think sometimes technology is a barrier to communication, and maybe that's what you mean as well. Time constraints. Active listening does take time. You have to actually hear, understand, reflect, and respond in order to do that. It does take time. And noise. There is a lot of noise that makes it difficult for us to communicate. Well, those are absolutely some of the barriers that we see as well. And the interesting thing about these is some of these are controllable by us. Others are environmental that we have to mitigate. So if I know I'm having a critical phone call and I know I'm in a busy office, I want to find a huddle room or a conference room or close my door if I have the luxury of having a door so that I can minimize that noise. I actually see clients that when they have their inside sales reps or any sales rep for that matter, having phone, they put out a do not disturb sign on their cubicle or their door in order to do that. One of the things that is one of the hardest or is an absolute barrier for us to address is stress. When we're stressed, it's hard to listen. We're in our own head. Our mind is racing. So sometimes when we know we're making those important meetings where we have to really listen to understand, we need to kind of figure out how do we de-stress, how do we take a breath, how do we clear our mind in order to focus? Really some things. But the bottom line is, if we can identify these barriers, and they may be individual to you or you in a specific situation, we can then figure out how to mitigate it. And without understanding the barriers, we may just continue to get in our own way and become a barrier to really understanding that. So how does listening play into the etiquette of a sales call? Well, at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that one of the roles of an excellent sales rep is to ask good questions. The challenge with asking good questions, let me turn off this. Make sure that we've got the view. Perfect. The challenge with good questions is that we don't want it to be an interrogation. So the underlying skill set that is the foundation of the value selling framework that we work with our clients on is how this cadence of questioning can be conversational as opposed to an interrogation. We certainly, as a sales rep, don't want to feel like we are Perry Mason or the district attorney prosecutor getting somebody on the witness stand and just hammering them. One of those techniques, again, is that 2 to 3 second rule, making sure that we take a beat and allow the individual to complete their thought before we go on. We also want to understand how to actually respond as opposed to react with actual to the answers. So thinking about how we listen is important. Here at Value Selling, our clients mastered the utilization of a tool that we call the value prompter. I don't believe that scripts for an entire sales call work. And the reason is because our customers and prospects rarely follow their lines. They don't memorize their lines, even if I, as a sales rep, have memorized mine. So there's almost always a challenge. We've all probably can think of situations where we've been on the phone with a telemarketer. Maybe I'll pick on telemarketers that are calling us at home, selling us something that we might not think that we need. And no matter what answer we give them, they're reading from their script. They haven't heard a word. They don't even care what I said. They're just reading from their script. In sales, we can't do that. We need to be prompted and reminded of different questions to ask, but how we ask them and when we ask them is dependent on what we hear. The other key is that we need to take notes. Active listening requires us to take notes. Remember, on average, we're only going to remember somewhere between 25 and 50% of what was said. Which is why sometimes team selling is so great, because if you've got two people listening simultaneously, you typically pick up on a little more information. But regardless, with that information, if we're capturing comments and answers. The other thing that happens when you're taking notes is you feed the ego of the person that you're talking to. Because if you write down something I said, all of a sudden what I said is important. I know it's important to you, and that also builds the relationship from that perspective. And then one of the keys to active listening is clarifying and confirming. Now, clarifying and confirming and reflection in active listening means I replay back what I hear in the exact words of the prospect. And confirming questions are a critical and often overlooked aspect of sales. But without confirming questions, often the prospect may not know if we actually heard everything that was important to them. And we may have missed something, or we may miss the opportunity for them to embellish, add on, or clarify. So reflective listening means I'm going to play back exactly what I heard in their own words and then ask them to verify or ask them to acknowledge or agree that what I have heard is what they have said. It deepens the relationship. It demonstrates that you have paid attention. And if I know I'm asking confirming questions in my mind, I know I have to listen. So it's one way, it's kind of a physical check that you can have for yourself that forces you to focus, eliminate the noise, eliminate the allure of multitasking, and stay focused on the message that you're hearing. In sales, confirming questions also can be our ability to kind of check, are we on track for the sales opportunity to unfold? And we call those trial closes. So when I confirm, I can also, in certain scenarios, use that as a trial close to just check in my sales process, in my sales cycle, am I actually moving this thing forward, and are we on the same page? So let's talk about what is the key to our success when it comes to listening. If we don't listen, we will, in the long run, be ineffective sales professionals. It is not what we pitch that contributes to our success. It's how we engage that contributes to our success. And listening is critical to engagement. Back in the day when Neil Rackham first created spin selling, it was all on the foundation of observing the high-performing sales reps versus the less performing sales reps. And the number one difference was the number of questions asked by a sales professional. That's great. We know we have to ask questions. But if we aren't prepared to listen and fully understand the answers, the questions that we ask in the long run may become irrelevant, because it's the gold and the deepening of the relationship is in our ability to listen and understand. Confirming questions are your ability in the conversation to demonstrate active, reflective listening. Taking notes, it will also demonstrate your active listening. And then leveraging that into written communication, which is a whole nother topic, is critical. And again, a very critical component to executing an effective sales methodology like the value selling framework. We surround this verbal face-to-face over-the-phone communication with written communication that, again, reinforces that we get them, that we understood them, we heard them, we listened to them, we understand them, etc. And all of this will enable us to be better sellers. The more we know, the better we can do. I'm teaching a class a while back, and a sales rep was going through the value selling framework, and it was a complete paradigm shift for this individual rep who believed coming into the program that what he really needed to do to improve his sales efficacy was become a better presenter, master the ability to pitch, master the ability to make sure that the message that he wanted to deliver was delivered in a way that was excellent. And they wanted presentation skills. The leader did believe that presentation skills were important, but beyond presentation skills, he felt that what they really needed was a skill set to better understand the customer in order to collaborate and create better contextual presentations. So we're going through a 2-day workshop, and a lot of what we teach clients is exactly this: how to ask relevant, deliberate questions to create need for your products and services, understand the impact and value of it, and ultimately create an opportunity that you can win. And this young man raises his hand at about 3/4 of the way through the program and said, "Julie, this is all great. I mean, I get this questioning thing. When do we actually start to learn how to sell?" I almost fell out of my chair, or fell off the bar stool at the front of the room. Selling isn't telling. Selling is listening and understanding, and then contextually collaborating and communicating in the context of that client. And without that ability to listen, it doesn't matter how good your presentation is. It has to be relevant and purposeful and collaborative. So how do we let them know that we're understanding them and that we're fully listening them? These are the key things. Paying attention. As silly as it sounds, that's the number one barrier for most people in listening. They're not paying attention. They're thinking about the next step. They're thinking about what they're going to say. They're reading their email while they're on the phone. They're looking at that. Somebody standing at their door trying to get their attention while they're trying to focus. Provide your full attention and focus your mind. Really think about how you can make sure that you're letting the speaker speak. Take that beat. Take a 2-second pause before you move on and before you interrupt. Make sure you're absorbing that. And then ask lots of questions, clarifying questions, confirming questions, reflecting what you heard so that they know that you got it. And again, the note-taking aspects of that. So we've kind of talked about this, but again, some good tips that will help you make sure that you are listening and demonstrating that. Really, really important that we do that. In today's world, I think it is harder than ever to eliminate the distraction, reduce the noise, and focus. We're bombarded with messages. We're bombarded with communication. Most professionals that I know now have 5 or 6 different communication channels hammering at them all day long. Used to be when we were at work, it was the phone. The phone would ring. That would be potentially an interruption. Now it's the phone, it's email, it's the cell phone, it's text. So not only do we have the business phone, we've got the mobile phone, and sometimes those are used interchangeably in business. But beyond that, we've got Skype and text and Slack coming on, and text messaging and other applications, and Salesforce, and all of these things that are dinging and interrupting us all day. And there are times when we just have to shut them down, turn them off, and focus on what we're doing at one time. So what would I suggest that you do as a result of this? Because I always think that it's important when we attend these personal development opportunities and webinars that we think about, okay, this was interesting. Now what do I do? And here's some ideas that you can use in your own personal action plan to improve your listening skills. Number 1, build the habit of restating and reflecting, of playing back what you heard in the words of your prospect. That means that you don't summarize and change the words. It means that you really reflect in their exact words. Language is powerful, and reflecting and restating in their language is critical. And the sales reps that are good at um, uh, flexing their communication into the language of the prospect do better than those that don't. Give feedback. Sometimes it is just making sure that you're giving feedback on what you heard, and part of that is that reflection. Probing. One of the things that is important for sales reps is to probe. We probe for a couple of reasons. We probe to get deeper understanding into something that we heard, or we probe to expand or get additional things out on the table that might not have come up in the natural course of a conversation. So probing is important because it demonstrates that we not only do we hear what we say, but we might be able to expand on that and add value in other ways as well. We want to think about how we avoid this, what we call kind of emotional labeling, and that's the bias that we come into that. A judgment and having judgment and having bias and jumping to conclusions in our mind. And then lastly, make it a habit to pause and use silence to your advantage, to make sure that the person speaking actually has the opportunity to finish their message and deliver it in an effective way. Oftentimes, I found myself dealing with prospects that they pause because they're thinking, but they're really not complete with their thought yet. And if I jump in too soon, I may miss the opportunity to learn something that's really important that would deepen the relationship, deepen my understanding, and allow us to move forward. And then again, the summarizing, clarifying, and confirming questions are critical for us to become excellent listeners. Understand the consequence of not listening. And if you just think about any of the times where you allow a distraction to dissuade you, or you allow the allure of multitasking to pull you off of that, remember, when we multitask, it takes 50% longer and there's 50% more errors. And so if we're multitasking during a meeting, that 50% is going to hurt us in the long run, and we want to make sure that we minimize this. It's deliberate. It's a skill set. It requires practice, and it requires discipline to make sure that we're conditioning our minds to actively listening. So would be happy to take any questions that may be right now on your mind, relevant to listening. Happy to think that. I'm looking through some of that. Oh, here's a good one. How do I actually minimize the distractions that are happening in my office when it is when there's so much interruptions coming at me? Well, I think the reality is we have to find ways to communicate to those around us that we are focused on the task at hand. So whether it's the do not disturb sign, whether it's find a corner of the office. There are times here in my office when I know I want to have an in-depth conversation where I literally go outside on my cell phone to sit down and have a conversation where nothing else can bother me. The other phone can't ring, the email can't buzz, Slack can't fire up with somebody being urgent. I mean, let's face it, today, people have no patience and expect immediate response. So I don't know about you. I've sat here at my desk on a sales call and I've had my phone ring, my other phone ring, have a text come through, see a Skype blast come through because someone can't get a hold of me and they're not even acknowledging that, oh, I might be doing something else right at that moment. When you are on a conference call and there's a lot of people in the presentation, at what point are you interrupting but you don't want to forget to ask. If I'm on a conference call and I've got a point that I think that needs to be made or a question that needs to be asked, I jot it down before I lose that. And then at whatever the point is relevant, where there is a pause or where I am asked for feedback, I then will go back to those notes. So if somebody's talking, I will also do that in a sales call, even on a one-on-one where somebody's talking about something and they say something and then maybe move on to a segue. I jot down a question there so I don't interrupt them. But when there is that pause, I can then go back and say, oh, can we go back to what you said previously? I want to understand one of that. When people pause and you are in a virtual meeting, how long is a good time to wait? I kind of give that 2-second rule. In a virtual meeting, sometimes pauses can lead you to believe that you've been disconnected. So you don't want it to go too long. But oftentimes in a virtual meeting, if there's a pause and I go 2 minutes, I may start with, may I ask a further question? Or, I don't want to interrupt. Are you done with that thought, or can we move forward in a different conversation? So if you're ever not sure, ask. But that 2-second rule often is good both virtually and as well as in a group meeting, etc. Great comment here that the challenge is that often we're expected to do multiple tasks, but the data shows that it's clear that when we are multitasking, rather than giving our full attention to a client or prospect, we are going to put ourselves at a complete disadvantage because you just can't, your brain can't read and think and listen at the same time. You can do low-level tasks simultaneously. Like I said, wash the dishes, load the dishwasher while you're having a conversation. But you cannot read and listen at the same time unless you've got the ability to you have to tune something out. So either you read something and you have to read it again later, or you haven't listened effectively and you miss the message. And listening is so important. So lots of questions here, some that I'm glad to announce or answer. Today's session is being recorded, and that will be made available to you later today. If you want to share it maybe with someone that you don't think listens to you, feel free. And you'll be able to find it on thevalueselling.com, and it'll be up shortly to either download the slides or to share or view the recorded message. I also want to let you know that in July, I'll be joining you again on July 17th to talk about business acumen. Value Selling did some research in the past year with a number of executives, and one of the key findings that we found is that buyers don't think that many sales reps have good business acumen. And in the void of business acumen, we will be hard-pressed to talk about the business value that we can bring to their organizations. So we're going to talk about how to think like an executive and the business of knowing your prospect's business and how important that is. So please sign up and join us on July 17th. If you're going to be on vacation, good for you. Again, that session will be recorded and you'll be able to revisit it. Last but not least, please engage with us online. Facebook, follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Facebook. Connect with me on LinkedIn if you haven't connected with me. Julie Thomas, you can find me. And share your comments, your feedback, etc. on Twitter with the hashtag Value Selling, all one word, or hashtag VSA Webinars. With that, thank you for your time and attention today. If there's anything I can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out directly. We here at Value Selling love working with sales professionals and helping them optimize their sales results and productivity. So let us know how we can help you and your team. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in July.